All right, so now I should be seeing my first slide.
Yep, looks good, Richard.
Yes, all right. And let me move the chat window out of the way so I can. All right, so what you're seeing here is the cover of my biography of Aleister Crowley, Per Durabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley. This is the revised and expanded edition of a book that was originally published in 2002. And actually, it turns out this edition was published in 2010, which makes this year the 10-year anniversary of this substantially expanded edition of the book. And again, this is not to be confused with the earlier edition. Okay, now my advance button does not seem to be working. Although, well, let's try this. There we go. Not to be confused with the original edition, which we don't talk about anymore. Just joking. But anyway, as you might have gathered, I have written, contributed to various books, journals, documentaries, and a few others kind of shown here. And the books I'm probably best known for include Per Durabo, picture here in the middle, Forgotten Templars, which Chris had mentioned, is my history of the origins of Ordo Templi Orientis up to and including, the beginning of Crowley's involvement. And then on the right here, we see Panic in Detroit, which is an expanded edition of a book I put out a few years ago. And this was just put out in this new edition last summer. And it's about twice as long as the first edition and is readily available, whereas the original was kind of a small press limited edition. Finally, I'd be remiss if I failed to mention that late this year or early next, the printing gods being with us, we'll see the release of a edited and annotated edition of Aleister Crowley's book, The Sword of Song, which should be pretty exciting. I'm excited about it, at least, that it will feature, for the first time, Crowley's book, Sword of Song, separately published for the first time since 1904. And I've gone through and heavily annotated all the obscure references, the things that he talks about that refer to current events that are no longer current and we may have forgotten in the ensuing 116 years what he was going on about. And I think that will help make the book a lot more intelligible. And in addition, I've gone back through Crowley's manuscripts and typescripts of the book and spent a lot of time talking about changes that were made, lines that were deleted, verses that were deleted and changed, and so on. So we'll really give an unprecedented look into Crowley's process in creating this remarkable book. Well, all that being said, let's go on to who was Aleister Crowley. And again, the idea of these various pictures we see here is to drive home the fact, the idea that I presented earlier is that Crowley is someone for whom there are many, many sides. And just a few of these are illustrated here. And what I'd like to do to drive this point home is to share with you a couple of quotes. One of these is from Henry Hall, who wrote an article on Aleister Crowley, introducing him to American readers when Crowley arrived on Halloween, basically, in 1915. And he spent the next 5 years living in the United States, traveling around. And so here's how Henry Hall introduced Crowley to New Yorkers and to the United States. One man to whom I spoke of him lauded Crowley as a poet of rare delicacy, the author of Hail Mary, a garland of verses in honor of the Mother of God. Another alluded to him as an unsparing critic of American literature. Another knew him as the holder of some world's records for mountain climbing. Still another warned me against him as a thoroughly bad man, a Satanist or devil worshiper steeped in black magic, the high priest of Beelzebub. An actor knew of him only as a theatrical producer and as the designer of extraordinary stage costumes. A publisher told me that Crowley was an essayist and philosopher whose books, nearly all privately issued, were masterpieces of modern printing. By others, he was variously pictured to me as a big game hunter, as a gambler, as an editor, as an explorer. Some said that he was a man of real attainments, other that he was a faker. All agreed that he was extraordinary. I love that quote because I think that really kind of gets to the meat of it, whether you find Crowley an appealing or an appalling figure, his life is certainly remarkable. And this brings me to a second quote from a letter from Aleister Crowley to Jack Parsons many years later in 1943. And I think this kind of puts Crowley into some perspective, and also from the perspective of his own perception of himself. And here we go. I wish, therefore, that you would realize that my universe is very much larger than yours. Some time ago, I thought of writing a book on internationally famous people with whom I had been intimate. The number ran to over 80. Am I wrong to suppose that you never met such people? Take another point. Have you visited the monuments of antiquity? Have you seen the majority of the great paintings and sculptures? Have you discussed all sorts of intimate matters with natives of every civilized quarter of the globe? Perhaps more than any of the above in importance, have you made your way alone in parts of the earth never before trodden by human foot, perhaps in hostile and nearly always inhospitable country? The point that I am trying to get you to realize is that any statement or action of mine is enormously modified by my having had these experiences. And while I think that quote there shows Crowley a bit of engaging in a bit of tooting his own horn, I think it also speaks to the fact that Crowley has had life experiences that very few of us can claim, and that this kind of informs his life and his view and how he's gone about living his life. So with that said, I'd like to offer just a kind of a quick capsule of Crowley's life here. So to begin with, he was born to a family that was rich and religious. And I think these two things define very much of Crowley's character and life. His father was a lay preacher, and he was sent to private religious schools or taught by tutors who were parts of his parents' faith, or at least close enough. Crowley actually admired his father very much and was devastated when he died, when Crowley was only 12 years old. His mother, and to an extent his uncle, Tom Bond Bishop, tried to kind of step in and kind of carry on Crowley's work or to represent that religious figure in young Crowley's life. And he just wouldn't accept that. It was kind of like treading on his father's, sacred memory. And instead he rebelled and resisted very strenuously, both against his mom and his uncle. He also became problematic at school. An abusive punishment there left him with albuminuria and a very poor prognosis. So he was pulled from school and he was sent on a rest cure with tutors and whatnot. And this gave him the opportunity, when he was away from the watchful eye of his family, to rebel against his tutors and later his Cambridge professors. And he also discovered all those things that had been forbidden to him by the strict fundamentalist upbringing of his family. And these forbidden things, including things like drinking, smoking, sex, books, and alternative spiritual beliefs. And this ultimately led him to magic. Also, part of Crowley's recovery involved the physical sport of rock climbing. And this actually led him to setting various records in terms of climbing rocks, chalk cliffs, and mountains. And it's on one of these mountaineering expeditions in the Swiss Alps that he was having a discussion in a beer hall that he actually met a Golden Dawn member, Julian Baker, who then introduced Crowley to the Golden Dawn. He kind of entered the Golden Dawn at a time when internal politics were already tearing the group apart. And within 2 years, the London lodge he had joined had just imploded and gone dark. And, Crowley spends a lot of time poo-pooing his Golden Dawn experience. In his confessions, you hear him say things like, "Oh, they swore me to secrecy, and then they gave me to memorize the Hebrew alphabet," which he thought was overly simplistic. But despite that sort of, negging of the Golden Dawn, basically, the Golden Dawn system actually was a very brilliant synthesis of then disparate esoteric traditions, which included things like the Kabbalah, the grimoires, Enochian magic, Eastern mysticism, Greek theurgy, and so on. And this really was the foundation that everything that Crowley did built on. I think it's fair to say that you cannot understand Crowley without understanding the Golden Dawn, because it really is at the foundation of everything. However, the collapse of the Golden Dawn left Crowley kind of at loose ends. And so he pursued other things, which included the study of Buddhism and Hinduism. And he actually did this by traveling and living on the Indian continent, and studying with his Golden Dawn mentor, Alan Bennett, who had since become a Buddhist monk. He participated in record-setting climbs of the second and third highest mountains in the world, K2 and Kanchenjunga. The only reason he did not attempt Mount Everest, which was the tallest mountain in the world, was that at the time that mountain was not accessible to Europeans. So he had to settle for number 2 and 3 instead. He also bought a house and got married. And it's that marriage that led to his honeymoon, which part included Cairo. And it is in Cairo that he had the experience of receiving the text, the Book of the Law, of which you've heard much so far today. And it is this Book of the Law, this automatic writing, this spirit transmission, whatever you want to call it, is this text that ultimately was the holy book that lies at the foundation of Aleister Crowley's philosophy of Thelema, whose core principle can be expressed in the statement, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." After that, it was off to the races. Crowley was at first a little bit of a reluctant prophet, but he ultimately accepted this role that had been foisted upon him by Aiwass, and he did it with great aplomb. So he started his Golden Dawn styled secret society, kind of filling the vacuum, the void left by the Golden Dawn. And this was the AA. He began publishing the Equinox as its official organ. And in the months and years and decades that followed, he discovered the idea of sex magic, and thereby became the UK Grand Master General of OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis, and eventually succeeded to become outer head of that order. He produced rituals and plays for a paying public. He, much like his father, the lay preacher before him, he devoted his life to promulgating the message of the Book of the Law through his writings and other activities. And is basically this activity, the spreading of his gospel of self-empowerment, self-determination, and personal freedom, through which he managed to shock the staid Victorian and Edwardian sensibilities of his time while befriending the intellectual elite. So if you look at a lot of his friends, they also tended to be people who were, also sticking their finger in the eye of, of convention. And through this sort of activity and through the friends that he surrounded himself with, Aleister Crowley managed to stay incisive and relevant to his last days. And in fact, I would say that his later writings, things like 8 lectures on yoga, the Book of Thoth in particular, are among some of his best works. And with that, what I will do is advance to this slide, which I think of as kind of a nativity calendar of the different parts of Crowley's life. And as I'd said at the beginning, some of these I'd actually broken out and given long lectures on just this one piece. And we can delve into any of these things that you would like. I think in honor of SOMA Institute inviting me here, I would like to nominate myself the Crowley as drug addict, or perhaps drug fiend is a better term to use. And because I know a lot of people who are here through through the connections to Chris and through the SOMA Institute will find this very interesting. And Chris, in fact, did a great job covering a lot of this material, so I don't want to repeat a lot of what he said so much as go into some other subject matter. And in fact, 3 points I think I want to make in this short segment are that to acknowledge that Crowley was an entheogenic pioneer, that I would like to say a little bit about his theories about use, abuse, and addiction. And there were some questions that came up about that, some conversation at the beginning of today's session. And finally, I want to dispel this whole, this myth of Crowley as the lifelong drug addict, which certainly is not true. So, there's actually a very funny story to this slide, which is where I want to talk about Crowley as an entheogenic pioneer. And the story here from this slide, if you'll indulge me, is that when I was in my senior year of high school, our English class was actually a class in British literature or English literature. And each of us were assigned to pick an English or a British writer, and we would spend the year reading and reviewing and writing essays about our chosen British author. And so naturally, I chose Aleister Crowley as the person I wanted to, spend my time with that year. And so I wrote, reviews of the typical stuff, the Diary of a Drug Fiend, Moonchild, and then kind of got into some of his nonfiction works. And then one day my English teacher took me aside and handed me the article that you see on this screen here. And she said to me, "Is this the guy that you're writing about?" And then she said, I was in my dentist's office the other day, and I found this magazine there, and I was reading, and I came across this article, and I just had, I had to tear out the article and bring it to you because I'm concerned that this is the guy that you were talking about. And I looked at this article and I said, this is sensationalistic bullshit. No, this is not what he is about at all. And my teacher kind of, oh, okay. I'm much relieved. And I think it says something about how naive I was, even as a senior in high school. That was probably a couple of years after I graduated that I pulled out this article and looked at it again and said, wait a minute, this is an article from the High Times, and my English teacher did not find this at her dentist's office. But be that as it may, the appearance of this article in High Times basically does testify to the fact that Crowley was indeed an entheogenic pioneer. Here we see a picture of Alan Bennett, who was Crowley's Golden Dawn mentor. He suffered from asthma and found relief from his symptoms through rotating various drugs that served as analgesics. And it's worth mentioning at this time that this is 1898 to 1900. All this stuff was legal. You could go down to your local chemist shop and buy drugs that you wanted. Sigmund Freud, as an example, was someone who loved cocaine, and he has letters talking about how he loves the fact that cocaine makes his mistress's cheeks look very flush and sexy. But it was Alan Bennett's use of these drugs to alleviate his symptoms that he also discovered that there is a mystical use for these substances. And Crowley, through his own explorations, had also drunk absinthe and Pernod, and he would later make cocktails like the Eagle-tailed Maya and the Kubla Khan, which included ingredients like laudanum and ether. While mountain climbing in Mexico, he was introduced to peyote, and then this kind of became his favored drug, Anhelonium lewini, and Crowley claims to have introduced its use to Europe. That may not be factually true, but Crowley nevertheless took credit for this, and he believed it himself. And let me see, I'm going to read you just a couple of short excerpts from Perdurabo, if you'll indulge me, just 2 paragraphs here. Although a poet and mountaineer, Crowley was above all a magician. He devoted himself to the study and practice of rituals designed to achieve non-ordinary states of consciousness and ultimately enlightenment. In his quest, all methods, including drugs, were fair game. His early years studying what he called magic included out-of-body travel and other occult experiments under the influence of various drugs. Performances of his ritual drama, The Rites of Eleusis, likewise included a reputedly psychoactive libation. Furthermore, this is I'm transitioning to the second thing I want to quote from. It was during a magical working with Mary Deste, or Mary Dest, or Marie Dest Sturgis, Sora Varacum, or some of her other names she might be known by, where again, the idea presented itself to Crowley. So November 21st, 1911. Drifting after a long, intense evening of sex and alcohol, Mary Deste muttered that a wizard named Abel Dees had just appeared to her in a vision with a message. Her lover, Aleister Crowley, a bit of a wizard himself, realized he was onto something. Ceremonial magicians traditionally used highly scripted rituals to conjure and converse with angels, demons, and other unearthly denizens. But altered states of consciousness produced by pleasure and purple and drunkenness of the innermost sense were far more potent. So, oh, there's William saying farewell from Berlin. Farewell, William. Thank you for joining us. Back to the presentation. So another one of Crowley's notable connections was with the laboratories of Parke Davis Company in Detroit, Michigan. And when Crowley arrived in the United States, again in October of 1915 and Halloween, one of his early trips that year was to the Parke Davis plant, and he talked to them about his interest in Anhelonium lewini, the psychoactive cactus, and Parke Davis took an interest in this, and some other chemists obligingly made him a preparation that he found much more effective than those he had used before. And Crowley carried out a series of experiments with this substance that he recorded in a diary called The Cactus. Unfortunately, this diary does not survive. It'd be great to know, what he did and what he saw. But we can only wonder. Here we see a cover from the magazine The International, which Aleister Crowley was editor of and contributed a great deal to. And this cover illustrates Crowley's essay on cocaine, which he contributed to this issue. The artist of this cover, in fact, incidentally, is Leon Engers Kennedy, who is the fellow who painted the portrait of Crowley in his ochre robes in a meditative pose that served as a color plate in the 1919 issue of the Equinox, sometimes called the Blue Equinox. Crowley also brought his buddy in to illustrate some of these magazine covers as well. But basically the point of this is to show that Crowley did write a number of essays about his experiments with various drugs. These include cocaine, And as we see here, we also have hashish, which Crowley wrote about in the Equinox, absinthe, something that he has an essay on, also in the International. And we also encounter the short story, The Drug and Other Stories. So this is something that Crowley definitely was made part of his exploration and practice for about 20 years of his life. So you figure about starting from his Golden Dawn years up through the Abbey of Thelema Chafaloo period. Now then, on my next slide here, I've got some suggestions for further reading. And this includes Chris Bennett's Liber 420, an encyclopedic work that touches on all manner of history of cannabis use specifically and other magical herbs. As Chris said at the beginning of the day, he didn't get to spend as much time on 19th and 20th century occultism. So we can look forward to his follow-up volume focusing on that. There's a paper by Partridge called Aleister Crowley on Drugs, which you can find online. And again, Patrick Everett's master's thesis, The Cactus and the Beast, focuses on the idea of the psychedelics that Crowley talks about. An interesting thing about Patrick Everett's thesis is that he looks at some of Crowley's visionary works like The Vision and the Voice, which, while Crowley's diaries don't specifically mention that he was partaking of these substances while he was doing The Vision and the Voice, Everett argues that the sorts of vision and synesthesia sorts of effects described in The Vision and the Voice are consistent with the use of Anhelonium Lewini. And this also took place around the time that Crowley was known to be experimenting with it. And it was, in the year after The Vision and the Voice that Crowley was kind of dosing people in the audience of the Rites of Eleusis with it. So, it's a very interesting thesis and worth checking out. And finally, last on this list, I just thought I'd stick this in here, is that back in 1999, after we had finished kind of co-editing an issue of the Oriflamme called, a collection of essays by Crowley released as Revival of Magic and Other Essays, we had actually put together a book called Crowley on Drugs, kind of as a pun on, Crowley on this and Crowley on that, for other titles. And unfortunately, that book, the timing of it was actually very convenient, because at that time I was working as a researcher at the Addiction Research Institute, which was part of an institute in Wayne State University's School of Medicine. And so it was, again, just this coincidental timing, but that book has been kind of shelved. I still kind of hope that one of these days, the collection of, again, a lot of these aforementioned essays, extracts from other works, diaries, and other unpublished material will see the light of day. So fingers crossed on that. And again, I think I will leave this piece of it here just because Chris already, again, spent a lot of time on this earlier, and I'd like to move on to the other 2 points that I wanted to make in this piece of the presentation. And one of these is to talk about Crowley's theories about drug use, abuse, and addiction. Here we see 2 essays that Crowley published in the English Review, one on the Great Drug Delusion and the other on the Drug Panic. Both of these are by Crowley, but he had to publish them under pseudonyms at this time because Crowley's name was kind of anathema at this point. This was, again, during the Chafaloo period, where the tabloids were calling Crowley the wickedest man in the world and were talking about the drug and sex orgies that he was having at his commune and all this kind of stuff. So his friend, Austin Harrison, who was the editor of the English Review, could only accept and publish things by Crowley under pseudonyms. And there were about 5 pieces on all that they published at this time. But these 2 pieces talk about Crowley's theories of addiction, as well as We see Crowley talking about this in The Diary of a Drug Fiend, the novel that he basically cranked out in 30 days in order to kind of get a payday from the publisher. And let me show you. This is the cover of the UK edition, which I think is marvelous. I love it. I'd love to see the book re-released with that cover one of these days. And this is the less interesting US edition of the book. But two of the main theories that Crowley had was that, and again, basically Diary of a Drug Fiend was kind of a commercial in a way, or an infomercial for the Abbey of Thelema. And the idea, the plot of Diary of a Drug Fiend is someone with a drug problem who winds up coming to the Abbey of Thelema, and through exposure to Thelema and Crowley's magic and so on, is cured. And so the book is kind of pushing the Abbey of Thelema as a place where people could go for kind of a rest cure. And so it's worth saying a little bit about how Crowley looked at this. And this kind of ties into the core of the concept of do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. In Crowley's mind, one should focus and devote oneself to fulfilling one's will, whatever that may be. And everything you do ultimately should be in service to accomplishing your will. And in his mind, drug addiction and abuse happens when you are taking drugs not in service or not to advance your will. That's when you kind of go off the rails and open the door to the potential of drug addiction. So when we look at Crowley's history and use of drugs, it always is in conjunction with his experiments in magic and spiritual advancement. And it's never in what we would consider, a recreational use. Although with alcohol, Crowley was known to be a social drinker, but these other substances, he was always analyzing, the effects, and writing in his diaries about what was happening. Again, as I mentioned earlier, he had this whole diary of his experiments with Anhelonium Lewini. So the idea here was that.
5:30.
I'm sorry?
All right, let's go. I'm leaving a really cool talk to come with you.
Okay. That someone else is leaving a cool talk. Thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it, and sorry that you're leaving. But now, where was I? Well, anyway, the idea was that if you are using these substances as an adjunct to achieve these altered states of consciousness and magical work and to realize your will, that inherently protects you from addiction. I'm not saying that that's the case, but this was Crowley's theory of addiction and how Thelema works in conjunction with it. Another thing that he did was that he had this idea that at the Abbey of Thelema, he had drugs readily available. So if you wanted cocaine, you could just go and find a drawer of it and snort to your heart's content. Then exaggeration, but I think the point being is that Crowley believed that by having this stuff available, that some of the appeal of something that's kind of naughty or frowned upon socially would kind of dissipate. And Crowley actually had a very similar idea with the paintings in the Chamber of Nightmares at the Abbey of Thelema. And if you're not familiar with that, basically what Crowley did is he took a page from Gauguin and he painted this chamber in the Abbey of Thelema with all these very lewd and provocative images, a couple of which you see here. The one in the center, or the bigger, the one on the left, I should say, which says cocaine, is referencing a line from his poem Lea Sublime, which runs, stab your demoniac smile to my brain, soak me in cognac, cunt and cocaine. And so is this sort of the idea that this sort of transgressive and just constant presence of this sort of imagery would kind of deprogram you basically from being titillated by sex. And he had the same kind of attitude with drugs. I have a little bit of anecdotal sort of evidence of that, I suppose, because when I was a kid, I had an older sister. She's about 18 years older than me, and she had married a police officer. And I remember him kind of dropping off like these glossy pamphlets. At that time they used to do this, just kind of talking about drugs and drug addiction and all this sort of stuff. I just thought it was fascinating, and I used to make little dioramas based on this. I remember finding an old shoebox and getting a rubber hose and a spoon and some cotton and a lighter and saying, this is what a heroin addict's, kit would look like, and I can just imagine my mom finding this box under my bed going, ah. But I don't know, I guess for me as a child though, just being exposed to that and just being able to explore, not literally taking the drugs as a child, but just, reading about them and educating myself about them, I wasn't quite as obsessed with it as some of my peers were when they discovered drugs, in their teens. So, again, maybe Crowley was onto something there. Crowley does have a diary that he tried to demonstrate his principle of will over addiction. And this is called Liber Saba vel Nike, or sometimes called the Fountain of Hyacinth. And basically what happened at this point, and I'll explain how this happened in the third part here, but Crowley found himself addicted to heroin during his time at the Abbey of Thelema. And he was also pretty hooked on cocaine at this point as well, for unrelated reasons. But he decided he was going to put his money where his mouth is and use these principles that he wrote about in these, in the preceding books that I mentioned, by trying to exert basically his willpower and essentially to go cold turkey, or at least to wean himself off in a very systematic sort of way. And the fact that Crowley released this as a liber as part of his occult works suggests that he believes that he proved his point. But my reading of this is really very different. I think that, he was able to kind of moderate, maybe tamp down his use, but at the same time, you read some of his diary entries that are part of this, and it really is just sort of like the classic addict sort of desperation and rationalization. And I'd like to read just two examples just to kind of show what I mean by that. So on one day at 4:27, he writes, I want to be able to get into some positive state of mind, no odds on what subject, and I can't. Only cocaine would help me, and I won't take it. Then 4:59, so half an hour later, his diary says, medium dose. So, he gave right into that impulse. Well, he held out for half an hour, but still. And we see a similar entry on another day. Medium dose heroin. This was a real indulgence in the worst sense of the word. It has occurred to me very frequently that I have taken a dose for reasons at present utterly unfathomable. So this dose was taken partly to prove to myself that I was not alarmed by the reflection set down above. And I found, I guess I have a third quote here on another entry. Medium dose. Excuse? A perverted sense of duty. The clock had struck 7. So I don't know, my reading of Liber Saba is not that he succeeded, but in fact that, I don't know, I think it just kind of demonstrated the extent to which he was sort of desperately hooked on drugs at this particular juncture. And I think that really segues nicely into the last point I wanted to make, which is just, dispelling this myth of Crowley being the lifelong heroin addict. And I think the short version of this is that Crowley was using heroin at 2 points in his life, and both times they were for medical reasons. So the way this starts is that Crowley's physician for over 10 years, a fellow by the name of Harold Batty Shaw, had prescribed heroin to Crowley as an analgesic for asthma. So kind of ironically, Crowley was suffering from the same condition that Alan Bennett had, 20 years earlier. At the time that Crowley was prescribed this, he was 44 years old. Okay, so bear that in mind. This is Crowley's introduction to heroin. It's medically prescribed. He's 44. And what winds up happening is that heroin becomes illegal in the UK 2 years later with the passage of the Dangerous Drug Act in Britain. And a similar law was passed in the US as well. So what this means is that Crowley was prescribed this medicine and all of a sudden told, you can't have this anymore. Well, what winds up happening is that Crowley is now living in Chafaloo and he's forced to buy his doses from the local dealer there. That continues for just a short time, however, because it's in September 1924. So this is just under 5 years after he was first prescribed heroin. So Crowley's, 48 at this time. He's in desperate financial straits, and he and several of his students, Leah Hersig, Norman Mudd, and Adam Gray Murray, are all reduced to sharing one room in this sleazy little hotel in France. And there's a diary entry from this period, September 1924, where Crowley writes, "My legs assumed independent control of the situation. I had a very amusing time watching them try to kick the bedstand to pieces." Which again is that classic kicking the habit, the sort of involuntary muscle spasms one has when going cold turkey from an addictive substance like heroin. So it was not, at the end of the day, it winds up being not Crowley's willpower, but the lack of money that ultimately caused him to get off of that habit. And it's really kind of at that point that we really don't see Crowley referring to drug use in his diaries after that period. It seems his period of experimentation had largely subsided. And as far as his asthma went, other drugs and other apparatuses became available for treatment and for management of the symptoms. However, Crowley did, for a second period in his life, wind up back on heroin. And this was in the summer of 1940. So again, fast forward another 15 years. So Crowley is age 64 at this time. And his asthma finally has gotten so bad, it had progressed, that none of the other treatments were helping any longer. However, by then, in the UK, which is where Crowley was spending out the rest of his life, heroin was once again legal medicinally and was dispensed in very controlled doses, sent to him through the mail. And his doctor at that time put him on the medicine. So his July 19th, 1940 diary notes his very first dose in 15 years, saying, "I'm quite dopey!" ! So contrary to this myth that Crowley was this lifelong heroin addict, he was really on this drug from age 44 to 49. Again, originally put on it for medical reasons, and then found himself hooked, kind of like the opiate crisis here in the United States. And then once again, starting at age 64, up until the time he died. But this, again, in very medically controlled doses. And contrary to some of the things that were sensational things written, that Crowley at the end of his life was taking enough heroin to kill a room full of people, that was not the case. So I hope that dispels some of those misunderstandings. And again, just shed some light on Crowley's encounter with drugs. So now we're at this point, we're at I see Q2. So we can do a couple things here. We can pick some of these other things from the nativity scene and explore other aspects of Crowley's life. Or we can open this up to just general Q&A for 15 minutes. So I think, what do y'all feel like?
Let's go for Sex Fiend.
Sex Fiend.
That's Chris.
Yeah.
That's Chris.
Is that you, Chris?
That's me.
Of
Sex
course.
and drugs.
What about Gerald Gardner?
Okay, well, let's see if we can try that one next if we've still got time. So let's try this one. So Crowley as the Sex Fiend. And basically the idea here is just talking about Crowley as someone who incorporates sex into magic, which was in some ways kind of revolutionary, but at the same time, not all that revolutionary, because if you look around, he was certainly not the only person doing this. But Crowley somehow became notorious for this, perhaps because he was more public about it, and maybe it was just timing. But what we find is that Crowley, as he sort of matured as a magician and as an experimenter, he began to deviate from kind of the Golden Dawn sort of ceremonial style of magic, the idea that you've got a ritual, the ritual is for a specific thing, you do the ritual and you're done and out. And he starts doing these magical workings, which are these prolonged, weeks or months long sorts of experiments where he is repeating things and trying things over and over again and to see what happens. So cases of examples of this are things like the vision and the voice, where he is obtaining visions for the 30 Enochian ethers. We see things like the Paris working, where he is trying to invoke either Mercury or Jupiter on repeated occasions under the idea, under the theory that there are multiple sides to these gods. Hermes is a god of magic, a god of communication. There's this phallic aspect to Mercury. He's also very mischievous as a child, and so on. And so if you were to repeatedly invoke this god, different aspects of that god would come out. The Obeldes and Amelantra workings are again examples of these prolonged experiments where he would kind of repeatedly indulge in this sort of combination of ritual and sex and mind-altering substances to put his partner, his seer, into an altered state of consciousness where they could communicate with these astral or transhuman entities, and Crowley could carry on these conversations and interviews and interrogations. And it's through these experiments that Crowley came to realize that sex could be a very useful and powerful part of ritual magic when incorporated into that kind of work. I'm clicking next and nothing has happened. Okay, so this is just the headings here of the workings or examples that I just mentioned to you. What winds up happening is when Crowley publishes his Book of Lies in 1912, 1913, thereabouts, Crowley gets a knock on his door. And this is from Theodore Royce, the head of the OTO, who accuses Crowley of openly publishing the secrets of the OTOs, the inmost secrets of the OTO, and saying that I must swear you to secrecy, so that you stop doing this. But unfortunately, if I swear you to secrecy, that means you are now a member. And hey, how would you like to be the head of the British section of OTO? And Crowley basically protests his innocence and says, I don't know what you're talking about. Royce opens to the page in particular. We don't really know what the page is. There's been a lot of speculation about that, but Royce points to a particular passage, and suddenly, like, the light bulb goes on, the rug is pulled out from under Crowley, and he says, oh my God, you're right. This is, the most important secret in magic. I agree. I accept. I will be head of your OTO in England. And that is what happened. And the long and short of it basically is that Crowley comes to realize that rather than going through all the paraphernalia of magic, which really are just kind of externalized symbols, the wand is the will, the dagger is the intellect, and so on, that rather than sex being part of a ritual, that sex itself can be the ritual. And Royce had only a little bit of practice in using this himself, and Crowley decided he is going to basically practice the heck out of this secret. So, and there's Theodore Royce. Hi, Theodore Royce. We see his thinking kind of on this incorporated into his ritual of the Gnostic Mass. And here I've stuck in, just for some amusement, a couple pages from a paper called My Life in the Love Cult. Just because they're very rarely seen, but these are pictures of Crowley purportedly holding court over scantily clad ladies who are flocking around him. Of course, this was nothing like what really happened. But what we can look at is this bar chart that I put together, going through Crowley's diaries, charting his various sex magic workings. I should point out that there is no bar for 1919 because there is no diary surviving for 1919. So it's not like Crowley suddenly became, ascetic or Platonic at that point. It's just, we don't know what he was up to. But looking at the surrounding years, we can imagine that bar would be somewhere in that same ballpark. But we see that Crowley is, engaging in quite a lot of sex magic rituals. He basically wrote them all in his diaries. I'm actually in the process of trying to abstract all this information in a data format that can be qualitatively and quantitatively analyzed. There's a little bit of this in Stephen Skinner's Magical Diaries of Aleister Crowley, but I kind of want to do this like for the whole span of his lifetime, because throughout his life, he treated every act of sex as a magical ritual, and he makes a note of it in his diaries. So it's a great data source. And as we see in this slide, this is a practice that he kept up, if you will excuse the pun, for most of his life, and it doesn't really trail off until, he's in his late 60s. So for all of us late bloomers into sex magic, there is hope. So that covers Crowley as Sex Fiend. Do we have time to talk about Wicca, or do we need to prep for next presenter? Chris?
We probably should. We could maybe take a couple of quick questions, and then
All right.
we'll introduce Richard Davis. Anybody got a question?
Sounds
quickly?
good. Let me stop.
I got one.
And fantastic presentation,
I just,
by the way. Thanks.
Well, thank you.
Go ahead.
Can you see me now?
hi,
Awesome.
my name is Chris. I'm the master of Swirling Star Lodge.
Oh, hi, Chris.
How are you? I think I met you when you came to our AIT, I think in 2012, way back.
Yeah. Me and Swirling Star go way back. It's
But really quick, since there's a short amount of time, I saw a little I came in late. I'm here to see Richard's presentation, the other Richard, and I saw that you had Crowley's ales there. Are those recipes extant? Because I used to brew beer, and I was just wondering if.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, Crowley's beer, basically that was his grandfather's and his granduncle's company, and they were very well known in the UK. And later they were bought by Watney's, which I guess is the famous British brewer. And I believe these were made up through the 1960s. I I can't say, I don't know enough about brewing for a fact to say for a fact whether like what they were doing in the 1960s was the same as what was being done originally, if it was the same formula or not. I've heard some interesting stories that that people have like found like old bottles of beers and liquors and being able to like scrape out the remains and kind of chemically analyze and reconstruct the formula. But I'm not, aware of whether that is known for this particular beer. I wish it was.
Thank you.
You're
Do you know
welcome.
if is still brewing?
I'm sorry if
the brewery that bought Crowley's ales, Watkins, I try to spell it, but I'm not sure.
I believe it's Watney. Unless I'm misremembering, but I believe they still exist, but they're no longer, they stopped making the Crowley and Company beer in the 60s. And then the label I think that you see there is from that era. The original Crowley ale and Crowley beers were in glass bottles.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so next up, we're going to have Richard Davis, and they have a really special presentation, I think, that's really relevant to the Aeon of Horus, double-wanded one. And, in many ways, the Book of the Law has been a zeitgeist. As a cannabis activist, I've really kind of seen Crowley's work as, almost foreshadowing and predicting this new age of entheogens that we're entering into. And I think, Crowley himself talked a lot about the androgyny of the age of Horus, and, every man and woman is a star, and everything in between that pole of man and woman is a star as well. And we're going to be having our next guest discuss that situation that sits between man and women and priest and priestess. And I think it's an important discussion to close on. And in this time and age, it's really something very important for all of us to think about. And I want to bring up, can you make Richard a host? And bring up our next guest, Richard Davis. And we look forward to the